Hello, dear audience. I'm Sverre Pedersen, Executive Director of Freemuse, a member of PACSOC, a filmmaker and human rights activist. I'm honored to moderate this webinar. Historically, global culture policies have been created and disseminated by Global North institutions, such as the European Commission, the UNIC members, such as British Council and Goethe Institute, or by international organizations such as UNESCO and the International Federation of Arts Councils and Culture Agencies, in which Global North institutions or countries dominate and whose funding sets the agenda for international cultural collaborations, even when there is significant Global South representation in the membership or governance of such institutions. In the ongoing genocide in Gaza and the related utter disrespect for international humanitarian law has exposed and affirmed that utter hypocrisy of the Global North, Western Europe, North America, Australia, and New Zealand with regard to human rights principles, anti-racism, social justice, and fairness, so that culture policies premises on these and others shaped by Global North interests and that affirm their economic, political, military security and cultural interests can or should no longer be the basis for further global culture policies and international cultural collaboration. So, how should we work with UNESCO, IFACA, and the UNIC members, considering the experience of the ongoing genocide in Gaza and the hypocrisy and the contribution to the genocide of the Global North over the past year? How should a new global culture policy paradigm look like? What should its priorities be? What is of most importance to the Global South, and with the experience of the Gaza genocide confronting us in setting culture policy premises and strategies? And how should these be advocated for and funded? These and more questions will be raised and discussed by today's panelists. After I have introduced them, we will start with the introduction by Fatin Farhat, followed by an introduction by Dr. Milena Dragićević, Šešić, and then an introduction by Mike van Graan. Their introduction will be followed by a discussion among them based on Mike's PACSOC approach. And after that, we will open for questions and comments from the audience. You will have to write your questions in the chat, which you find in the bottom of the page. Fatin Farhat is an independent culture manager and advisor with over 20 years of experience across the Arab region and beyond. As a researcher, her research focuses on the governance of the independent culture sector in the Arab region, the status of Arab artists, social security, fair payments, pension schemes, and collective bargaining. Her current PhD research is titled A Feminist Approach to the Performing Arts in Palestine. Fatin has acquired a deep knowledge of the culture and media ecosystems in the region and has thoroughly investigated best practices of funding and culture policy implementation. Currently, Fatin is a member of the two UNESCO expert facilities, the 2005 Convention on the Protection and Promotion of the Diversity of Cultural Expression, and of the Cultural Resource Artists Board. And the 230 Culture Indicators. She has previously served as a vice chair of the Cultural Resource Artists Board and a funding member of the Brava Fund. Dr. Milena is Professor Emerita at the University of Arts, Belgrade, and she is the former president of the University of Arts. She has been involved in the development and realization of over 50 projects on culture policy in countries around the world. She is an UNESCO expert for culture policy and management, and she has consulted for UNESCO, the Council of Europe, the European Culture Foundation, and the British Council. She is a board member of the European Diploma in Culture Project Management. She has published 20 books and more than 250 papers, translated into 17 languages. She is a Commandeur des L'Ordre des Palmes Académiques from 2002. Mike van Graan is a playwright with extensive experience in policy formulation and advocacy and building artist networks, both in South Africa and across the African continent. He was the founding Secretary General of Arterial Network and have served on the experts of facilities of UNESCO 2005 Convention on the protection and promotion of diversity of cultural expression from 2011 to 2018. He serves on the steering committee of the Palestinian Art and Culture Solidarity Collective, PACSOC. So, Fatin, please take the screen.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me well? My internet can be not very stable in Ramallah. First, I would like to start by my contribution to this webinar by thanking all the people, beautiful people, artists, policymakers, activists who stand by Palestine and work for Palestine. And I'm very pleased to be with you tonight, this afternoon, and also with the great speakers who are also great friends. And I'm seeing so many familiar names on the screen from across the globe. Friends, thank you so much for being here today. Your actions might seem small, but they are significant to us and to me personally. Before I move forward, I would like to note that this presentation is based on an article I had written a few weeks ago, commissioned by the Flanders Art Institute, commemorating the first year of the Gaza genocide. For me, I find it extremely difficult to talk about Gaza and the culture sector in Gaza and in Palestine and keep a straight face. It's very emotional, and I struggle to address audiences, but I'm doing it because I owe my friends and colleagues in Gaza this much at least. Several of you might not know, but as a Palestinian who lives in Ramallah, I was born and raised in Ramallah, I have no access whatsoever to enter Gaza without almost impossible to get permits by the Israeli occupation, and this is before the genocide. I have friends from Gaza who have come to study at universities in the West Bank almost 2 decades ago and could not even go back, could not visit families, could not visit their aging parents or dying family members. My dear friend Daula Salama, who runs Film Lab Palestine, a few years ago lost her father in Gaza to cancer, and she could not go and attend his funeral. So it really did not start on October 7th. I visited Gaza a few times as a child and only twice as an adult. As a child, my parents used to take us to the beach in Gaza, believe it or not, and I still have fond memories and beautiful images, photos from that period. I managed to visit Gaza in 1997, but my last visit to the Strip was in 2020, a few months before COVID-19 lockdown. So on the surface, on the surface, I was there to conduct a workshop on behalf of UNESCO to disseminate information about the 2005 Convention on the protection and promotion of the diversity of cultural expression. In reality, this came after 20 years attempting to get the proper clearances by Israel to enter the Gaza Strip. So over 5 days, I visited numerous cultural spaces from Beit Lahia in the north to Rafah in the south, smoked hookah with friends I had not seen in decades, and engaged in numerous social and work-related conversations with artists and colleagues. The trip was very emotional for me. It was my doorway to a part of my homeland, so near, yet so far and so forbidden. And for me, it was an eye-opener also about the resilience of the people who live in Gaza. I know that the word resilience is overused and abused, but in the context of Gaza, it really has a special status. It was an eye-opener about the resilience of artists and art organizations isolated by a siege, almost 20 years of siege, and left out from changing and developing artistic practices and important relevant conversations in the cultural sector in the Arab region and across the world. So the whole discussion about UNESCO Convention 2005, since we're talking about policies today, seemed surreal in that God-forsaken land that everybody had forgotten about. What is the value of cultural policy under the siege, under occupation, without a state? What are artists' rights under the siege? And how can we even speak of creative industries and global cultural economies when the world has almost forgotten about us? These were only a few of the questions that were raised by the tens of art operators and practitioners that I met in Gaza. Fast forward 3 years, and for the past 11 months, I have watched my friends in the art field and beyond in Gaza being slaughtered like farm animals, literally slaughtered, not killed, slaughtered. The Gaza death, I'll give you some statistics that you probably all know, but a fresh reminder. The Gaza death toll of over 40,000 Palestinians, including 16,500 children, is horrific. Israel's genocide has wiped out at least 900 families completely. At least 1,364 families have only one surviving member. Having said this, the actual death toll of the genocide might not be known for years, because in addition to these recorded deaths, many have not been recorded, and also many Gazans have died from famine, from sickness, from other reasons, as a result of the genocide. 60% of Gaza buildings were damaged or destroyed as of April 21. UNICEF counted 408 schools damaged, representing at least 72.5% of all schools in the Gaza Strip. Of those, 53 school buildings have been completely destroyed, and 274 others have been partially damaged by direct fire. Now, as far as culture and the cultural heritage are concerned, quick statistics as well. As of September 17, 2024, out of the 120 sites that UNESCO has been able to assess through satellite imagery, 69, almost 70 sites have been damaged since October 7. 10 religious sites, 43 buildings of historic importance and artistic interest, 2 storage places of movable cultural property, 6 monuments, 1 museum, 7 archaeological sites. At least 45 artists and cultural managers and 167 journalists were killed in Gaza in 1 year. This is the highest in all conflicts that we've witnessed in the last century. More than 45 cultural centers out of 76 cultural centers registered with the Ministry of Culture were completely destroyed. So the genocide that we've been living is not only about killing and injuring the maximum number of Palestinians or Hamas fighters, for that matter. It's actually a genocide against the people, the cities, the urban fabric of Gaza, of the Gaza Strip. The concept of the camp, not only the architecture, but also the social concept of a camp, the social fabric of society as a whole, and above all, our story, our narrative. It attempts to delete all of these from the surface of Earth while the world is actually watching. There are tens of examples that show, that are represented, especially in Western media, on how our narrative is being attacked. Notice this. Western media uses the term the Hamas-Israel war. Yeah? By using this terminology and changing the narrative and the language, we Palestinians do not exist. We are not a party to what's happening in Gaza now or in Palestine now. And by placing the focus on Hamas, the world is giving a green light to Israel to destroy all of Gaza Strip, thus destroying Hamas. And this is what we've been witnessing for the past 11 months. And here, when we talk about international organizations, let me read to you the introduction you could find on UNESCO's website in the section about Gaza during the genocide. They did some assessment of cultural heritage and journalists' status. And please listen carefully to these 3 lines. Following the Hamas terrorist attacks against Israeli civilians on October 7th, The operations of the Israeli army in the Gaza Strip have caused a dramatic humanitarian crisis and massive destruction, affecting all aspects of civilian life. Here, we Palestinians don't exist, and our fight for freedom is reduced also to a humanitarian crisis, also by UNESCO. So, for us, Palestinian artists, art managers, and practitioners, the reactions post-October 7 last year were, of course, confusing and frustrating. It took the world, even some of our friends, who have always been advocates of Palestinian cause, a while to speak up about the issue of Palestine. We literally had to be slaughtered in thousands for people to react. Many cultural sectors, especially in Europe and the USA, acted as if the Israeli occupation of Palestine did not exist and that the whole conflict between Hamas and Israel started in October last year. Amid our own plight and our attempt to survive and navigate this great loss and feeling of loneliness, we were forced to go back to history and remind our friends and enemies that the genocide of our people began from the onset of the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948. Over the past few months, we have also come across several statements by European cultural foundations that refer to the brutal occupation of our land and the disposition of our people as a conflict, and that miserably failed to place our plight as a people in the proper historic context. On top of that, several of our friends, colleagues, and others in the cultural sector and beyond were either cancelled or even censored. Our voices were attempted to be hushed. And we, Palestinian artists, as the victims of decades of genocide, we were requested to show understanding and patience. It was shameful, it still is, it still makes me angry. I sat in my living room in Ramallah watching the news day and night, speechless, thinking of the tens of initiatives I had witnessed spring to support Ukrainian artists right after the Russia-Ukraine war. I remembered all the actions to sanction Russian artists from major world venues. At the same time, the West went on a witch hunt against one of Palestine's most pacifist resistant tools, BDS. Not only they denied us the right to resist, but also attacked our pacifist movements. And the university students in campus in the USA were demonized, and the students were attacked. Of course, the reaction to what was happening at the level of the Arab region was a bit different. At the level of governments and Alexo, which is the Arab version of the UNESCO, we hardly saw any action. Once again, the reaction came from the Arab independent cultural sector. It was there, but it was limited, and it was not limited due to lack of will, but mainly due to lack of access for funding and support from the international community. A couple of months into the genocide, several organizations, including Action for Hope, Ittijahat, the Cultural Resource, Aflamuna, among others, they reached out, and the main focus was how to support the resilience of artists in Gaza, their safety and their well-being. This was the main focus at the beginning of the genocide. And although there is now a bit of space to support some art initiatives, and we're seeing this happening because the movement of displaced people has a bit decreased, the rehabilitation of Gaza's destroyed cultural heritage, infrastructure, and the cultural sector is a massive task that is not a priority at this point. I want to note that the foundation of many of the Gaza's artist support work is based on respecting artist choices. And this is something we have to remember when we think, what can we do to Gaza? So, to support the resilience of those who want and wish and choose to stay inside the Gaza Strip. And there are many of them who don't want to leave. And at present, and before the Rafah crossing border point was burned down and shut by the Israeli occupation, tens of artists, designers, content creators, architects managed to flee to Egypt. The truth, however, is that the world considers caring for these artists who managed to escape the genocide a burden. When you contrast it with any conflict, including the plea of our great Syrian artist friends from Syria post the 2011 revolution. One is stunned. Syrian artists did have chances. Doors were opened for them. Doors are locked in the faces of Gazan artists. So what do we do now? And this is a question for us Palestinians inside Palestine. Do we continue business as usual? No, it won't work that way. Our funders and partners inside Palestine and outside Palestine were the first to impose sanctions on us and pull out. The escalated situation only revealed the fragility, and I mean the administrative fragility and dependency of our institutions on outside aid. Can we break free from that? We've had a session 2 weeks ago, a month ago, to discuss this issue of how we navigate the issue of funding. How can we heal from this trauma as Palestinians, as individuals, and as a community? What are the expectations, the new expectations of world cultural venues of us? What images do they want us to present? And what images do we want to present of ourselves at this point? And for me, the most important question is, how will we shape our relationship with the world after the genocide? How do we interact with the world from now on, with the people who stood with us and those who failed us? These are some of the questions that we tend to struggle with at the moment. Let me check my time. I don't have a lot of time. Let me be quick. I'm not a pessimist, but I'm a realist. And I understand that it's very difficult now to change world order. However, there are things that can be done on the short term that you can help with also. The first is to continue speaking on our behalf and being our voice in our communities. And please don't waste so much time and energy on international agencies and governments that don't give a damn about us on the short term. It's a waste of time and energy. Instead, let's build solidarity movements within both the global and the global South and the global North. Remember, this year has taught us that global South is often an agent of post-colonial apparatuses as well. So it's not that clear. The global South, the global North they're interconnected, and we have to understand this complexity. We have to open space for smaller and new actors from other sectors as well, from human rights, from women's organizations, and so on, to work with us. We have to plan more programs to support displaced artists and help create programs to support the artists who wish to remain inside the Gaza Strip. We must strengthen the cooperation with Palestinian cultural organizations, not only in Gaza, but also in the West Bank. Every single action, even the smallest, could make a difference. We have no illusions, but we believe that small actions make a difference. Okay. Do I get just 1 minute to close by a quote that I found today on Facebook by our friend Basma al-Husseini?
Sure.
Okay. So as I was thinking of how to close this presentation and not to sound very pessimist and very angry, I came across a post that was written today in the morning by Basma al-Husseini. Basma al-Husseini is a friend who runs Action for Hope, which is an organization that works with the artists under threat and in crisis regions. And she landed in Beirut yesterday to continue the relief work on ground with Lebanese artists and institutions. So I tried to translate some of her sentences because they're very important on the long term so that we don't lose hope. Basma says we are doomed to defeat as long as our actions are oriented to the present. The present is against us because in the past, we did not work for the future and so on. For there to be any hope of victory, all our actions must be directed towards a future that we will not live in. This does not mean ignoring the present. On the contrary, we must think carefully about the reasons for our defeat in the present and how we can change these reasons. Thank you. And sorry if I was a bit long.
Thank you very much, Fatin, for this very strong and really emotional introduction. We're looking forward to hear more from you when we are in the next phase of the webinar. So please, Milena, the floor is yours.
Thank you. It's very difficult to speak after testimony that Fatin just have presented to us, but it's exactly now what is our part to say what is responsibility of us, cultural operators, academics, activists, coming both from global north and global south, and why it's so different today in the situation of this terrible war in Gaza, that somehow we look silent, we looked somehow auto-censored. So I would like to focus my presentation on taboos, on feeling of guilt, but also on auto-censorship among world cultural practitioners that, due to very different reasons, coming from dependency to their funders, whether they are regimes or international foundations and so on, prefer not to interfere, let's say, or let's use the word politically, in the contemporary life. I absolutely share the same feeling that Fatin expressed, that Palestinian artists, cultural operators, workers, and people in the widest sense, community of Gaza is left as no one used to be left in history, somehow alone, without the real help of international community. That's something that haven't been seen for a long time. And I have to say, starting with my positionality, because everything we speak, we reflect, we feel, our ethics depends from our backgrounds, from where and in which atmosphere we have been raised. My childhood was, part of the most important ideas of the country I grew up, Yugoslavia, was the creation of non-aligned country, fight for international justice, for decolonization, and that's how we developed a certain sense of responsibility to help less fortunate of ourselves, because we are still colonized, and still today we have a lot of real colonies. I would say that Palestine is one example of post-colonial situation that was resolved by the global north, in that time called the West, but in improper way, in a way that it was unable to solve it for how many, 70 years already. So Gaza issue, for me, was an issue since I started to work in Middle East, in the Arab world, to develop both cultural policy research and cultural management training. Why? Because during this 20 years of engagement, I met only once one person from Gaza. And he came to our seminar in Morocco with 2 days of delay because he didn't get papers, visas, everything necessary for travel on time. So today we are watching genocide in Gaza, but in previous years, we were watching apartheid, we were watching isolation, we were reacting, commenting, but through this process, we completely lost trust in international organizations, even those that we are working together, Fatin and me, for example, in UNESCO, because whenever there is a crucial issue that has to be solved. International organizations are giving nice words, but no acts. So who is taking responsibility today? And it's among what I call cultural counterpublic, independent cultural sector that feel marginalized and without resources today, even in the global north, because contemporary politics and life is more and more populistic and I would say everything opposite to values that arts and culture are bringing. They are the only one to try to connect different cultural agencies, institutional system, non-profit, independent sector in raising at least few issues of not only total genocide, I would say human, but also cultural genocide that is happening not only in Gaza, but throughout territory of the Middle East, because memories on Palestinian cultural history and so on, they've been erased for a very long time by different excuses, from urban planning, development, roads making, and so on. We are watching already for years how new settlers are occupying territories, how basically what is not acknowledged by international law is acknowledged by international non-behavior. And rare are cultural organizations that are making their stand. I still remember a very powerful Norwegian artistic project about apology, fake of course, of Norwegian National Theatre to Palestinian people. And I know how big diplomatic scandal this produced, but at least Norwegian state didn't interfere and didn't, how to say, follow demands of Israeli state to ban this video, this artistic work and so on, or to make it very clear that it's about fake apology and so on. But it's independent group. It's not even public theater that did what they were supposed to do. However, today, there are some efforts of artistic academic community, such as ELIA, European League of the Institute for the Arts, to connect, to make proclamations, and to try to, I would say, to try to collect all experiences, to make online repository on higher arts education responses to the crisis in Gaza. Unfortunately, these you can count on the fingerprint, on the fingers of, okay, two hands, not one hands, but still, it's too little, it's too few. It shows high level of auto-censorship of academia in rich Europe, in Europe that public domain has autonomy, freedom, and where people do not have a real fear of auto-censorship, but they like somehow not to disturb the present political ideas and so on. However, there are a lot of strategies that wants to raise issues in counterpublic, in cultural counterpublic, among independent sector, that want to raise, to cut this silence on situation in Gaza in its totality, but specifically total ignorance of the fate of the artists. We don't even know if there are artists in Gaza. Can you imagine, or can you think about, for example, Venice Biennial this year, with this fantastic title, who was supposed to be provocative, about foreigners everywhere, but it was a really missed opportunity for real discussions. Again, the global north is dominating with its representation of its guilt toward their own subaltern, like in Australia, Australian Aboriginal, in United States and in Canada, behavior toward the native population, so-called First Nations and so on. So basically, we can say that real problems of contemporaneity were not discussed, and the real presence about them, those that are coming from the situations where nation states are not democratically, liberally enlightened to give them voice, didn't have really any chance. And we could not see any, how to say, representation of responsibility regarding wars in Sudan, Ethiopia, I mean, throughout the world, exploitation, and basically exploitation, I mean here about mining throughout the globe, which brings many nations and peoples destroyed, like Tuareg, for example, in Niger and throughout Sahara, etc., which made their, I would say, fundamentalization. So what are those strategies that the weak counter-public of Europe is doing? Petitions, proclamations, documentation of art activities, giving voices to artists from war territories, but very low, very rarely. Translation, I could remark, for example, in my country, raise of, even now for the first time, the same book of translated folk stories is really named the Dead Stories from Jerusalem. It's not just Arab folk stories and so on. But art residencies, there are not that many as it exists or it were existing in the first year of Ukrainian-Russian war. Presence of artists coming from all these Middle East territories is by pure chance, unless if they are living already there. So basically, I understand I have to close soon, and I would like to say only a few words for the end. I think that we all have to fight now, coming from art and cultural sector, not for empathy. Empathy is there or it's not there. You cannot fight for it. We'll never have it. But we have to fight for responsibility and solidarity and cultural policy of care. So this cultural policy after post-genocide Gaza has to take in account what was happening, has to care not only about cultural infrastructure, but about cultural people, but about people, about infrastructure, but also about narratives. That's what Fatin mentioned. We accept mainstream politically imposed narratives. We are repeating them, changing vocabulary, and those vocabulary are changing emotions about certain situation, about considering people, and so on. So I think that it's time for bottom-up cultural policies that we are going to contribute to. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Milena, for this very deep understanding you have of what we are actually handling today. I'm looking forward to the talk you will have with Mike and Fatin after Mike's introduction. So please, Mike, take the floor.
The ongoing genocide in Gaza has exposed in the most overt manner possible the underlying power structures and dynamics that serve and reinforce global apartheid. On the one hand, a white minority comprising less than 10% of the world's population that pursues and maintains its dominance through unspeakable violence and the assertion of their cultural hegemony. And on the other hand, the majority world, overwhelmingly people of color, who are dehumanized, othered, and rendered expendable in the economic, political, cultural, and security interests of the minority. If we were unsure or ambivalent before because we were sucked in by their powerful propaganda or co-opted by the resources, we now know unequivocally from the perpetrators of the genocide in Gaza and from their white liberal democracy enablers such as the United States of America, Germany, the self-appointed genocide experts, the United Kingdom, Australia, and much of Western Europe that one, those who claim to be civilized are the actual barbarians, destroying and reveling in the destruction of children, women, innocent civilians, and thousands of years of knowledge and architecture, and violating international law and humanitarian conventions with arrogant impunity and contempt. Secondly, as it was when the Universal Declaration was adopted in 1948, the same year that the State of Israel was born through terrorist violence and the acquiescence of the United Nations that comprised just over a quarter of the countries who are members today, human rights are deemed to be the prerogative of human whites. 3. The same racist impulses that underscored slavery and colonization so that colonial powers like France and Britain could actually adopt the Human Rights Declaration while denying those very rights to millions of people living under their colonial rule, today inform the ethno-settler project in Palestine and the support of former colonial powers who themselves have histories of genocide against indigenous people. 4. Democracy and freedom of expression are at best sticks with which the white minority world uses to beat their enemies and to claim the moral high ground when their suppression of criticism of the genocide and their failure to heed the will of the majority at the United Nations exposes them to be tyrants and fascists. We are led, fifthly, to believe that it is Islam that is inherently violent, yet it is Judeo-Christian religious beliefs about the chosen people, the end of days, the return of the Messiah, that play a not insignificant role in the violent destruction, the warring, and the mass murder taking place in Palestine and in neighboring countries today. Kill them all, write the evangelical Christian politicians on the bombs being shipped to Israel, for this will deliver the Armageddon that they believe will take them to heaven while raining a hell on the rest of the world. And 6, is the racists, those who declare others to be less than human, who claim to be the victims of racism, brandishing the race card of anti-Semitism as a fig leaf to cover their naked racial arrogance, the violence that flows from it. If ever there was a metaphor for the downright hypocrisy, the laughable double standards, and the sheer evil of the white Western world, it is the provision of aid to Palestinians at the very same time that they provide the bombs and missiles to slaughter them. Against the backdrop of how the white Western world has been exposed, or rather, how it has revealed itself through the ongoing genocide in Gaza, the following should be clear. First, Western interpretations and hegemony with regard to human rights can no longer be the standards of human rights. The very Universal Declaration of Human Rights, a product of its times in 1948, needs to be redrafted in accordance with meaning infused with recent and contemporary global experience. 2, the Global North agrees that cultural rights are human rights, but argues strongly against cultural relativism. In other words, that where human rights conflict with cultural rights, human rights must prevail. But it is the very reduction of the human rights of Palestinians relative to Israel and its Jewish citizens that the supposed universality of human rights is radically contradicted. And it is Western media that humanizes white people and dehumanizes people of color, rendering their fundamental human rights and freedoms subservient to the beliefs, the values, and the interests of white people. Third, starting point of white Western nations is that Israel has the right to exist. In other words, as a white settler colonial project, it has the right violently to remove indigenous people from their land and to oblige them to live under military occupation. The decolonial project will only have succeeded then when Palestinians are free to govern themselves with full statehood, rights, freedoms, and security guarantees. 4. Western nations have long promoted Israel as the only democracy in the Middle East, deliberately blind to how it discriminates against its Arab citizens and the subjection of millions to brutal military law. It is white liberal democracies that have enabled and defended genocide in broad daylight, thereby delegitimizing democracy as a desirable form of government. In a few days' time, the world's self-declared greatest democracy in the world will elect one of two genocide enablers as its president, and very possibly a racist, misogynist, Islamophobic, convicted criminal who does not even believe in democracy. Long live democracy. 5. While sanctions have been imposed on Russia that has been deemed to violate the UN Charter and international law, not a single sanction has been laid on Israel despite the findings of plausible genocide by the International Court of Justice and the reports of numerous humanitarian organizations about the constant violations of humanitarian law. The slaughter of thousands of children, the forced displacement of hundreds of thousands of people, the bombing of hospitals and makeshift shelters, mass starvation, the targeted murder of journalists, medical personnel, and aid workers, the torture and rape of prisoners, bulldozing over live human bodies. These are acceptable to the barbarians who wield massive economic, political, cultural, and military power. We should know from this that morality in our world today is determined by naked power, not by ethics, not by any sense of common humanity. An increasingly polarized world where multilateralism is in decline and yet global challenges require global consensus in vision and strategy, it is imperative that we seek to work together for the sake of humanity as a whole. However, the genocide in Gaza and the complicity of the global north in this genocide requires a fundamentally different cultural discourse that is shaped by, that serves the majority world. Historically, international cultural policy and cultural exchange have taken place largely on terms set by white majority countries. This is for at least 5 reasons. A, they dominate global trade in the production and distribution of creative goods and services. B, they dominate global and regional institutions like the European Commission and UNESCO that shape cultural policy. C, they have global reach through institutions like the Goethe Institute, the British Council, the French Institute, as well as media and entertainment platforms. D, they provide resources and opportunities for creatives in the global south and so are able to co-opt and silence us. And E, given the lack of support for the creative sector in the global south, the global north has superior intellectual and human research and legal resources to bring to bear in shaping policy instruments and international collaboration that serve their interests. In closing then, what should be some of the priorities of cultural actors and policymakers within the global south and their allies in the global north? 1, cultural policy should take account of the fact that just as it is with the world as a whole, so the global south is not a homogeneous entity. So rather than a one-size-fits-all approach to cultural policy, greater research into the varying conditions and the inequitable distribution of resources and markets needs to be done to inform cultural policies that are more nuanced and responsive to local needs. Secondly, there must be greater interrogation of existing and recent global cultural policies and actors on the understanding that cultural policies and international collaboration are not silos, nor do they happen in vacuums, but rather are integral to upholding and reinforcing existing power relations. Global South practitioners need to understand how we engage and participate at times in our own oppression and marginalization in order ultimately and hopefully to resist it. Clearly, there needs to be greater research and affirmation of indigenous knowledge, indigenous beliefs and values, as clearly the morality, the values and belief systems of the dominant minority do not serve the interests of broader humanity. Second last, it is often spoken about, but there needs to be far more concerted efforts at South-South engagement and collaborations, rather than the traditional divide and rule, North-South vertical relations that perpetuate inequality and global injustice. And finally, we need to find new models and new sources of funding for creative practice in the Global South, and convince our governments of the significance of culture in asserting self-power, in projecting alternative perspectives into the global market of ideas, values, and beliefs. Global South cultural actors need to be weaned from our dependence on Global North funding so that we may more freely define and pursue a humane Global South agenda and arts practice, unburdened by the constraints and self-censorship imposed by Global North funding. The Palestinian people have paid and are paying a heavy price for the opening of our collective eyes. We now have a moral obligation urgently to seek a new world order underpinned by a truly humane culture so that their sacrifices have not been in vain. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mike. This was indeed a very strong and very thorough way of making a clear picture of the situation, and several in the audience have asked if it's possible for them that we can send your introduction on email afterwards. You think that's possible?
Oh, happy to.
Very good.
Thank you.
So please, then we will open the floor for the three of you. And I think Mike have posed some very important questions, but also Fatin and Milena has had some important things to continue to dig into. So I will ask you now to start a discussion among the three of you to present to the audience. How should we really start now, and what can we do, both as PACSOC is aiming for finding funding for artists and culture workers in Palestine in this critical situation, but also in a more broader way of advocate for a ceasefire and a stop of the occupation. So please, who want to start?
I might start because I think that Mike really put it so clearly and so precisely, and it reminded me on some points that I have missed about possible solutions, especially, for example, his third point about new sources of funding, how not to be dependent on always same sources that are imposing their agendas and their priorities, and we usually react as cultural operators and do those things that are proposed by funding schemes. So I will remind all colleagues on one rare act of solidarity with Palestinian people that happened by cultural operators, by poorest kind of cultural operators that came from India, Jana Natya Manch Theatre, that was probably the only one that really organized solidarity action for theatre in Jenin. Theatre in Jenin now, during this period is under severe pressure of Israeli authorities, settlers, and so on. Leadership is imprisoned and so on. But even before, they've been leading their battle practically isolated in this occupied territory of Palestine. And Indian theater activist group organized a touring across India for raising funds for Jenin theater, for bringing them to India to travel, to have another experience with colleagues and so on. But these kind of examples are really rare. And I would like to underline, and if that was possible for militant street theater that is not funded by any public funds in India, which is not supported by big corporations, that is mostly supported by donors and so on, that they took their responsibility and create actions that might be possible worldwide. Because there is now, I look at from the small perspective of my country, another trap. When we get disappointed with EU policies, with big international policies and so on, our governments are turning toward other actors. BRICS is seen in many countries, global or global south, as a possible solution. Unfortunately, those countries are ruled by populist, autocratic leaders. They're most of them non-democratic countries and so on. You cannot expect any kind of really transformative change, cultural policy change, with the help coming from Turkey, for example, which is very often coming with substantial help for cultural sector in less fortunate countries of global south. So in this respect, we really have more to rely on ourselves, not to look, and that is one very important issue, how to see possibilities in self-organizing, in taking our responsibility to create new solidarity networks and try to find different contents. And I will fully endorse this responsive cultural policy to the needs of fragmented global south, because needs are so different in different areas of the world. Sometimes really are focusing to survival of languages, cultures, population, and so on. Sometimes it's more about gender equity, sometimes it's more about something else and so on. So there is no universal, and that's probably should be one of the major outcome of our discussion, as I think it was your first point, that diversification of cultural policy instead of uniformization of cultural policies that are happening today globally, thinking that just if we apply universal conventions like Convention 2003 or Convention 2005 and so on, everything is going to be solved. It's not going to be solved because any of those conventions has in fact different meaning and different readings in different parts of the world, and accents should be very different.
May I add
very much, Milena. So please, Fatin.
Yes, I'll add just a few sentences. I think considering the humanitarian crisis that Gaza is going through now as a result of the political situation, again, it's not a humanitarian crisis, it's a byproduct of the genocide, that in terms of funding, culture and cultural heritage are not going to be a direct priority in the period to come. They might be used as a tool of empowering youth, psychosocial support, and so on. There could be some funding, but I think we have to be realistic that a lot of the funding that, even with people and organizations that have shared values to support Palestine, will now go into humanitarian aid and building schools and so on, as far as the bigger picture is concerned. For me, I think what we need to do is to look at the initiatives that already exist. There are quite a few initiatives, as myself and Milena said, from the independent cultural sector in the Arab region, and also initiative like the initiative ONE, which was discussed in the previous webinar, of a Palestinian coalition on dealing with the issue of funding. What I know for a fact is that if the cultural sector in Palestine alone, and there's a question by Kutab, I think Atallah Kutab, about this funding, the cultural sector is small in comparison to other sectors operating, NGO sectors in Palestine. So on its own, it cannot dictate an agenda strong enough. So what's happening on ground is that there are bigger coalitions that are being built between different sectors, human rights, women's organizations, and so on, that are all dependent on foreign funding. This dependency, and we cannot look at funding without looking at the history. This dependency on foreign funding, especially in Palestine, had started with the peace process. And it was said by Imam Hamouri in one of the webinars. What happened after the peace process, that the main question in Palestine was changed from freedom and independence to building a civil society, to building a state, a statehood. And therefore, the funding also changed as a result of changing the questions. One of the things that we can do, again, locally from Palestine is, and it's being done now, is that the sectors are working together. We can survey the initiatives. Action for Hope had initiatives. Al-Mawrid has Kun Ma'al Fan, Stand with the Art initiative that supports individual artists. Now in Lebanon, of course, now we have to remember we're focusing on Gaza, but we have Lebanon coming up. The situation in Lebanon is really, it's not as brave as in Gaza, but it has many characteristics that resemble the genocide in Gaza. So that's another thing. I'm part of an initiative that Gazan artists put together. Mainly, it started with visual artists, but now it's expanding. Al-Hassale, which is more like, I don't know how to translate it to English, but Gazan artists themselves are mobilizing to work together, raise some funding in order for them to survive, especially the ones abroad. So one thing that we can do is to survey these initiatives and support them, and individual and small support counts. It makes a difference in this particular period. It will not make a difference in the future when we speak about infrastructure and rehabilitating the cultural heritage infrastructure. But at this point, this is possible. I tend to be, lately, I'm becoming also a bit extreme. I think in Palestine, in terms of funding, we have to reconsider our tools and frameworks. We're adopting foreign, European, not foreign, Western tools in how we run our artistic projects. This was not the case before the peace process. We had the particularity of leadership, of cultural leadership. So we seem now to be imprisoned by this global trend of how to run big museums and how to be a good curator, blah, 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 which is fine. I'm not undermining that. But maybe it's about time for us and our friends to reconsider the whole modality that was put together post-peace process, and it does not seem to be working well, and because it heavily relies on foreign funding and not on local funding. Yeah.
Mike?
Yeah, I was just going to say that, as people would have seen from the chat, that one of the working groups that we have is in fact this fundraising working group for PACSOC to help to raise funding for the very precarious creative sector in Palestine, and working through ONE as well, as you mentioned, Fatin. And maybe just to again say, there are not very many people in PACSOC who are part of our steering committee, as it were. So we are looking for increased capacity, because we really do need people to assist us in some of these strategies that we are wanting to implement over the next month, and particularly around the 29th of November, which is the International Day of Solidarity with Palestine. So what we are wanting to do is to encourage cultural organizations throughout the world to contribute even $500, $1,000 over the next month, maybe climaxing on the 29th of November. If we can, we have, as PACSOC, this modest kind of fundraising goal of $100,000 for the creative sector in Palestine. And so I'd like to invite people who would like to work with us who are in this webinar today to let us know if you're willing to work with us both on this as well as on the cultural policy things that we've been talking about and some of the advocacy around the Goethe Institute and other unique situations. So these webinars are very much about bringing to attention of our broader colleagues throughout the world the kinds of things that are being worked on at the moment and inviting increased participation in the pursuit of the goals that we have. So please send us your details afterwards. You've got the details in the chat there, pacsoc@gmail.com. We'd love you to work with us.
Thank you very much, Mike.
If I might add something.
Sure.
About one more group of people that I think should be much more responsible than it is. It's researchers, and especially in cultural policy researchers. In 2014, International Conference in Cultural Policy held in Hildesheim devoted the main, the main platform was devoted to Arab cultural policy groups, Arabic cultural policy. Our colleague with whose text Fatin has closed her presentation, Basma Husseini, was there, and many, many others. This year, 10 years after, 2024, in Warsaw, there was none. No single academic, not only from Palestine, from the whole Arab world, to say, or there was no presentation. There was explicit presentation, keynote speech about cultural genocide in Ukraine, but even within this keynote speech, Gaza was not mentioned. Gaza was mentioned only in the discussion afterwards. There were some people really upset that this issue was missing from our debates. But that's basically on all NCAT conference, all conferences about cultural policy that I'm attending, and I'm attending many, mostly, of course, organized by Global North, because that's where things are happening on this level, are ignoring or wants to ignore. But when we held International Federation of Theater Research 2018 in Belgrade, that was very interesting event. It was 1,000 scholars of performance studies gathering, and the specific session was created on the spot, self-organized. Again, interestingly, by Indian colleague Sruti Bala, who is working in Amsterdam University, but on the spot, feeling a necessity that the voice of the people from Middle East should be heard, and informing us that they are not there because they couldn't get visas, they couldn't get, although university professors, researchers, and so on, they're prevented to travel and to participate. On the other side, there were several Israeli scholars who presented very important works about deliberate Israeli cultural policy to neglect Palestinian cultural heritage. But I was chairing one of those sessions. It was the session with the smallest number of participants because people are basically boycotting like Israeli scholars. Nevertheless, that they are bringing knowledge, insights, and points that are really brave, contradicting official policies of Israeli state. So I think that the academic community is behaving even less responsible than artistic community. Just by not wanting, like, I'm not researching this field, I'm not competent, so I don't have anything to say because I'm not expert in this field. But this is something that we have to raise, that scholar is responsible not only for his small, narrow area of research, but is responsible for the ethics within international relations. And this academic world, I think we should more connect to our cultural sphere.
Very good.
I'll maybe just make a point in relation to one of the items that Milena mentioned, the issue of travel. And I think that this, is a metaphor for the inequities that prevail in our world today. Because we have these amazing conventions and these new kind of cultural policies that speak about fairness, right? Fair culture, done by UNESCO's German kind of body now recently. We have the 2005 convention adopted in 2005 that supposedly grants preferential access to global north markets for creative goods and services from the global south. But again, the inequitable structures of the world are such that, and it goes all the way back to colonial periods, people from Africa, on average, we can travel to about 55 or 60 countries without a visa or a visa on arrival. People from Europe, from white majority countries, can travel to 160 countries without having to apply for a visa. So, here we are claiming that as the world, we have become more civilized, we've moved away from colonial structures and so on. But in the very reality of who can travel and who cannot travel, we have the classic example of who the world really works for, whose interests are kind of served. So this is why the point that I made earlier, that was reiterated by Milena, about us having to find policies that are relevant to local context and local needs, as opposed to coming up with these like grandiose plans that cannot be applied because of the way that the world is structured inequitably, and because of the completely different ways in which people have access to resources, whether it be financial resources, infrastructure resources, or human and intellectual resources. So we really do need to revisit the way in which we make policy and the way in which we apply them because of the structural inequities. And we must, again, interrogate, as I was saying earlier, the ways in which these policies that we think have to do with fairness actually perpetuate unfairness and inequity.
If I can add, just I can't resist, because you mentioned preferential treatment, and Convention 2005 was meant to promote it. In reality, I just finished the research about main measures done on the behalf of the convention throughout the world, 100 countries involved. Main measure was not preferential treatment, but export policy. Export policy is not even mentioned in the convention, but most of the instruments cited by different governments as applied after Convention 2005 are export measures to support export by countries who are already very powerful, such as Canada, Australia, and so on. So it seems that it's what is happening by this instrument of cultural policy is reinforcing power and economic gain of the global north, not helping really the global south.
Yeah, and the irony is that all three of us speakers today have been part of that UNESCO technical facility, right? And
yes,
we were there because we were kind of hopeful that when this instrument was adopted, it would make a real difference. But in fact, this instrument was brought about as a consequence of turf wars between France and Canada on the one hand, and the United States on the other. They were worried that with the World Trade Organization coming into being, their creative products would simply, and their creative economies would be flooded by products from a much more dominant America. And so they corralled the rest of the world to come and support her for this 2005 convention to allow governments to protect their creative industries and to invest in them without it being seen as unfair kind of subsidies, which is what the World Trade Organization frowned upon. And I think a lot of Global South countries kind of signed up to this because of what the convention promised, that there would be this international fund for cultural diversity that would make funding available for investment in the creative industries of the global south. That global north markets would be open to them and so on. But if you look at the amount of funds that have actually gone into the International Fund for Cultural Diversity, it's less over this long period of time than the marketing budget of one decent Hollywood blockbuster. So, it's simply that the global north countries who wanted this particular instrument have been served very well by the fact that they've got this measure to protect their own industries, but the global south has simply not realized the benefits that were promised by this particular document.
I think it's time to open a little for questions from the audience, but please, Fatin, if you have something to say first.
No, I think over the years and working on Convention 2005, I became less obsessed with it, more realizing that it's a framework, general framework that might have long-term impact, but it couldn't and shouldn't be our starting point, in my opinion, to deal with the issue of Gaza because of how the world politics is set up, and also UNESCO's position, to be frank. I haven't seen many statements by UNESCO. I've seen some shy statements by UNESCO as per Gaza, nothing in comparison to what all the statements that we've seen during the Russia-Ukraine war. You just do a simple Google search and you see the difference, you see the language. So I'm not very optimistic. I understand the value of these conventions long term, but in terms of Gaza now and the situation in Palestine, I think that we really have to depend more on the independent cultural sector, not to waste our time. A long time, we will make an impact. Now there are urgent things that we can do. We tend to talk a lot about funding. It's not only about funding. It's not only about money. Money is important, but venues across the globe who believe in the Palestinian cause can program Palestinian artists and Palestinian activities. It's very simple, in your seasonal programming, just incorporate one or two activities about Palestine and invite, and Lebanon now too. And Sudan, we tend to forget Sudan. For me as a Palestinian, it's heartbreaking that in spite of what's happening in Gaza and how heartbreaking it is, no one is talking about Sudan. And what's happening in Sudan is grave and needs also our attention. So Sudan, Lebanon, Palestine, in terms of our region. I'm not even going to start in terms of So what we need to do is to be a bit more focused. A platform like this one is very important. Showcase Palestinian, Lebanese, Sudanese art. Support small initiatives. A small initiative could seem very small, but it could save an artist's life. The artists who are strangled, Sudanese, by the way, and Palestinian artists who are stuck in Cairo, they need support. And the amounts of money are not huge. We're not talking about millions that will develop or rehabilitate the cultural heritage infrastructure in these countries. We're talking about saving individual lives with small amounts of money that relatively when we're speaking about the West. So we can do that as well. As I said before, we can look at the initiatives that are already happening on ground. Abdel Mohsen Foundation has been challenging many of these initiatives because it's based in Palestine. It has a venue in Gaza. Reach out to them. Talk to Al Mawred. Talk to Afaq, to Basma Al Husseini. And I'm too tired to talk about Convention 2005. And really, I'm disappointed in UNESCO's reaction, not only me, but other scholars and researchers in Palestine as well. Let us focus on what we can do with our own hands at this point and think long-term after at least the people that we love and care about survive this genocide.
Sure. We have a few questions and comments. Atala Kutab asked, what is the solution to dependency on funding on donors that are not allowing the needed space for aspiration of the culture scene in Palestine? If cultural institutions say no to that funding, what is the alternative to break such negative dependency? Who want to start?
Yeah, I think we kind of addressed this question a bit, right? Let me go back this one is by Atallah.
Yes.
Right? Yeah. As I said before, if you look at how the funding system for NGOs in Palestine is set up, it's not only about the cultural sector, it's about different sectors, women, human rights, children's, and so on. So, and there is, as we said also before, and Mike, Dounia know about this initiative, our own initiative, there are debates and discussions within Palestinian societies, first to how to act to those who are censoring or imposing political conditions on funding for Palestine. Second, how to diversify funding, and also how to reconsider the whole framework on how we work. This is a massive work, yeah? But for the past, as I said before, for the past 20, 30 years, we've adapted, it's like copy-paste NGO models from that are suitable to the Dounia community, where this vague thing called transparency is a priority. And I think it's about time that we, as Palestinians working in the sector, to reconsider our way of doing business. We cannot continue to do business as usual with the same setups and systems. So it's not an easy question to navigate, and there will be losses in this process. Some organizations are going to suffer, and we see this now. We see cultural organizations who are unable to keep their doors open as a result. Diversification of our resources, reaching out to friends, to solidarity groups could be some of the answers.
Thank you very much. You want to add anything, Mike?
No, I'm good, thanks.
Thank you. Milena?
Can we go to the next question about media?
Yeah, the next one is both a comment and a question in the end. No, that's the third. Nan van Huse, sorry if I pronounce your name wrongly. I believe that we need to leverage mass media reachability to mass audience. BBC, for example, has had some amazing documentaries on Palestine. So, do you have any comments on mass media?
I wanted to tell a few words about it. Unfortunately, the lack of interest of mass media for arts and culture is such that even, for example, Al Jazeera Balkans is the main resource of information for us in the whole Balkans about the situation in Gaza and the whole Middle East. But they never ever speak about arts and culture, because it's not, even when they report about Balkans, because we are watching them, to be very honest, because they are representing all territory of former Yugoslavia. So for my generation, it's better to watch Al Jazeera Balkan news than any national news, because they're only linked to Serbia. But they never have any report about arts and culture, only sports. That's it, politics and sports. So yes, we had the exhibition of, what was the name, Taisir Batniji in his works in Belgrade, but media were not interested to speak about it. It was organized by Association of Artists. It was even, the exhibition was happening in the moment when he as artist has lost all of his family in Gaza, in the few days delay of mass killings in that moment. And even that was not like artists who care. So that is something that I think is a responsibility of public media. And yes, BBC, that might be the one who have a good reportage and so on as representative, but how to make it translated in different local languages, because otherwise, yes, of course, I'm watching from time to time BBC World News and CNN and many other different international networks just to get feeling how it's reported. But arts and culture, we have to self-produce our information and to use more social networks and to create platforms for redistribution of cultural news. That's my feeling.
This is very much the same when the countries are answering the UN Human Rights Office on the UPRs, Universal Periodic Reports. They hardly write anything about art and culture. So the art and culture sector has to be more active to promoting what we are doing and how important art and culture is for a thriving and open society that are actually respecting human rights.
May I add something very quickly? I think it's not only about the interest of mass media and art and culture. It's about the narrative. What kind of an narrative do they advocate? BBC could do fantastic documentaries on Palestine, on art and sector, but their own narrative is anti-Palestinian. If you watch the news and see how we are portrayed and the language used when we are killed and so on, it is a narrative that is anti-Palestinian. So of course, part of it has to do with their coverage of art and culture. Yes, for sure. But the other with mass media is how we are positioned as a nation in the case of Palestine. What kind of a narrative these TV mass channels, media channels present of us? How do they see us? What kind of a language they use to describe us? And we've seen this very vividly in comparison to how Israeli civilians or citizens or soldiers are described, as opposed to how we are described. The focus on their names, their age, whereas we're only numbers. We're killed by random powers. The source of our killing is often ignored, even with BBC. So I think that infiltrating such strong mass media, it's not an easy task. But what we can do is to offer alternative media outlets and promote them, like Democracy Now!, like others, work more on social media, online, because the task of dismantling this narrative with these big media companies is not going to be easy.
Thank you very much. We have one other, which is also more comment, I think. We have one.
It's a Julie Ward that written about how she succeeded to put that on agenda. And I think that's exactly fits what was my main thesis about our individual responsibility to, whenever we are members, part of organization or something, we have to advocate for what we think is just or what is important and so on. And organizations, networks, cultural, artistic, and so on, are not to really fight unless we take responsibility to push for that. And Julie has presented that in a chat very well. How it's possible to be done if you care. So policy of care, we have to care to achieve something.
I think we need to start winding up the webinar. We have been on now for a little more than 1.5 hours. So I will just repeat what Mike said. We are happy to invite people in the audience to join the Culture Policy Working Group or the fundraising group, or any other things you would like to do together with the PACSOC. And we are, of course, happy to send anyone who wants it the PACSOC discussion document. So just contact, and we will send you what you are asking for. And then, of course, as the last part, we are asking everybody to support the funding for the ONE initiative. You have seen where you can pay in the chat. So please just spread it to friends and networks. Every penny counts, and we have to increase the work to make better funding for the different people and organizations that own an initiative. It's crucial, and it has to be done now. Would anybody of you have last words? It doesn't look like, so I will, from my heart, thank you very much for this great webinar and sharing your thoughts and knowledge with us. It has been so rich and so enlightening. Thank you very much.